This is the story of how one African leader, armed with nothing but a message from a ghost, walked into the lion's den. From the secret vaults of Geneva to a high-stakes showdown in the Elysée Palace in Paris. But the real question isn't whether he got the gold back. The real question is what he did when he discovered the gold was just the tip of the iceberg. What you are about to see is not just about a lost treasure. It's about how a single act of conscience can trigger a quiet revolution, exposing lies that have cost millions of lives and billions of dollars. And trust me, the final revelation is more shocking than you can possibly imagine. Stay with us, because this is the story you were never meant to know. Subscribe for more video. The morning sun cast long, sharp shadows across the polished surface of President Ibrahim Traoré's desk, illuminating the quiet diligence of his office. His days in Ouagadougou typically began this way: a methodical review of reports on agricultural projects, security updates from the volatile border regions, and the formal diplomatic exchanges that wove the delicate fabric of West African politics. It was a routine of stability, a deliberate rhythm he had imposed on a nation yearning for it. But on this day, buried beneath a stack of routine agricultural assessments, lay an anomaly. It was a simple, unmarked manila envelope, crisp and out of place, bearing no seal, no postage, no hint of its origin. Curiosity piqued, Traoré set aside a report on crop yields and slid the envelope open. Inside, there were only two items. The first was a weathered photograph, its edges softened by time. It depicted a group of uniformed French colonial officials, their expressions unreadable, standing before the open cargo bay of a military aircraft. They oversaw men loading heavy wooden crates onto the plane. Traoré's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the location instantly, not as it was today, a bustling commercial district, but as it had been, the old Ouagadougou airfield. The year, he guessed, was 1960. The second item was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. The script was elegant, yet seemed to tremble with urgency. Its message was brief but explosive. 40 tons of gold, taken not as reparations but as theft. The documentation exists. The gold exists. 72 hours before the records are destroyed forever. An old debt awaits collection. At the bottom was a precise sequence of numbers and letters that looked like coordinates, followed by a short phrase in an indigenous language he knew from his childhood. The ancestors' blood calls for justice. Traoré studied the photograph again, his mind racing. For decades, it had been a persistent rumor, a bitter legend whispered among elders, that the departing French administration, in the final days before Burkina Faso's independence, had looted the nation's treasury, spiriting away a vast gold reserve accumulated from years of colonial exploitation. He had always dismissed it as a painful but unprovable myth. Yet, here was a photograph that seemed to document the very act. If it was authentic, it wasn't just evidence of a crime, it was the key to a history that had been deliberately erased. He pressed the intercom on his desk, his voice firm and clear. "Get me Minister Ouedraogo and Security Chief Ouedraogo. Immediately." Within 30 minutes, his most trusted advisors were assembled in the quiet gravity of his office. Finance Minister Ama Ouedraogo, a brilliant economist who had left a prestigious career in Europe to serve her country, examined the photograph with professional skepticism. "Mr. President, we must be cautious," she began, her tone measured. This could be a sophisticated manipulation, aimed at creating diplomatic tension with France at a very sensitive time. Security Chief Michel Ouedraogo, a man whose pragmatism was forged in the crucible of regional conflict, nodded in solemn agreement. "The timing is more than suspicious. We are in the final stages of renegotiating mining contracts with several international corporations." "Someone sends you this now? It feels like a trap, designed to make us act rashly." Traoré listened, acknowledging the validity of their concerns. His government's push for greater national control over Burkina Faso's natural resources, particularly its gold mines, had already strained relations with Paris. A public accusation of a 60-year-old crime would be seen as an unacceptable provocation. "Your points are valid," Traoré acknowledged, his gaze still fixed on the photograph. "But ask yourselves this. What if it's authentic? 40 tons of gold. At today's prices, that would fundamentally transform our nation's development capacity. It would mean schools, hospitals, clean water for millions." He tapped the coordinates on the note. "This appears to be a location in Geneva, Switzerland. Minister Ouedraogo raised a skeptical eyebrow. The banking capital of Europe. How convenient. We need to verify this, and we need to do it discreetly, Traoré decided, his voice imbued with a newfound resolve that silenced their objections. If colonial officials did, in fact, steal our national reserves, there must be a paper trail, somewhere in our archives or theirs. And if it's true, asked Security Chief Ouedraogo, the unspoken question hanging in the air, what then? Traoré looked from the photograph to the faces of his advisors, the weight of his nation's past and the hope for its future settling upon his shoulders. Then, he replied simply, we reclaim what is rightfully ours. Not through war, but through historical justice. The 72-hour clock had already begun to tick. With the 72-hour deadline now a tangible adversary, a quiet storm of activity engulfed the presidential palace. Traoré's decision had set in motion a frantic, clandestine investigation. Within hours, a small, highly vetted team was assembled, each member tasked with pulling on a different thread of the cryptic message. Burkina Faso's National Archives Director, Professor Salif Kabore, a man whose life was dedicated to preserving the nation's memory, was summoned from the university. His mission? To scour the colonial-era financial records for any mention, however faint, of a national gold reserve. Simultaneously, a young digital forensics expert from the National Security Agency was given the weathered photograph, her objective to hunt for any sign of digital manipulation or forgery. Every hour lost was an hour closer to the deadline. By evening, the first findings began to trickle in, presented to Traoré in his secure conference room. The forensics expert was first. Mr. President, she said, her voice filled with a mix of awe and trepidation, the photograph shows no signs of digital alteration. The paper's aging, the chemical composition of the photographic emulsion, the film grain. It's all consistent with documented photography from the late 1950s and early 1960s. The image was real. The scene it depicted had actually happened. The report from Professor Kabore was even more telling. He hadn't found a document, he had found its ghost. The archives are meticulous, both before and after this period, the professor explained, his finger tracing the spine of a heavy, leather-bound volume. They document gold production, tax revenues, asset transfers, everything. But for the 3 months immediately preceding independence in August 1960, there is a gap. It's as if those pages were deliberately and professionally removed. He showed Traoré the bound ledger, its telltale stubs of cut paper a silent testament to a historical wound. Someone didn't just want to steal the gold, they wanted to erase the memory that it ever existed. Finally, Security Chief Ouedraogo delivered his intelligence report. The coordinates in the note point to a specific safety deposit box in a private vault facility in Geneva, he confirmed, his tone grim. It's not a bank. It's a company called Sécurités Discrètes SA, specializing in ultra-anonymous storage for clients who value privacy above all else. He paused, letting the implication settle. We've also traced the envelope. It was hand-delivered to a government mail clerk by a European man yesterday morning. Security cameras captured a clear image of him, but initial facial recognition has found no match in any of our databases or international watchlists. He's a ghost. The evidence was mounting, forming a chilling mosaic of a meticulously planned theft and an equally meticulous cover-up. But with less than 60 hours remaining, the central question became one of action. Traoré made his decision. I need to go to Geneva. Quietly. Both of his advisors immediately objected. The idea of the president leaving the country on such short notice, based on an anonymous and potentially hostile tip, seemed reckless. Mr. President, this is an unacceptable risk, Minister Ouedraogo argued passionately. Send diplomatic representatives. Let us handle this through official, protected channels. Or send my operatives, the security chief added. A small, covert team can access the box without exposing you or the office of the president to danger. Traoré shook his head, his decision unshakable. If this is a diplomatic matter, they will bury us in procedure until the deadline passes. If it is a trap, sending anyone else might spring it. No. He picked up the handwritten note. This message was addressed to me, to the leader of this nation. Whoever sent this expected me to come personally. His voice lowered, filled with a conviction that transcended political calculation. If this is truly about our nation's stolen wealth, a wound inflicted at our very birth, then it must be confronted by Burkina Faso's elected leader. This is a matter of national dignity. After an intense debate, a compromise was reached. President Traoré would travel to Switzerland, but under the official guise of a previously unannounced meeting on sustainable development initiatives. A minimal security detail would accompany him, maintaining the lowest possible profile. Meanwhile, Minister Ouedraogo would lead a team digging deeper into historical records, preparing for the diplomatic firestorm that was sure to follow if the evidence proved conclusive. "We have less than 3 days," Traoré reminded them, the weight of the moment pressing down on them all. "If this is legitimate, it changes everything. If not, we have lost little more than time." Before dawn the next morning, Traoré boarded a nondescript government aircraft with a small entourage. As the plane climbed above the awakening West African landscape, he found himself studying the mysterious photograph again. The faces of the French colonial officials showed no guilt or malice, just the routine expressions of men conducting official business. And yet, if the message was accurate, this single, faded image documented one of the greatest thefts in African history. The fate of his nation was now tied to a safety deposit box in Geneva, and a key he did not yet possess. The flight to Geneva was a capsule of tense silence and furious preparation. As the aircraft carved its path northward across the vast expanse of the Sahara, Traoré and his team worked tirelessly. They reviewed briefing documents prepared overnight, detailing every known fact about colonial-era gold production in what was then called Upper Volta. The records were clear. The region had been a significant source of gold for the French Empire, with consistent extraction from multiple mines. Yet, the official transfer of assets during the 1960 independence ceremony made no mention of any national gold reserves. It was an omission that, for 60 years, had been mistaken for a simple lack of wealth, rather than the result of a meticulously planned heist. As the aircraft began its descent over the snow-capped Alps, Traoré gazed out at the serene landscape, his mind a whirlwind of possibilities. Burkina Faso remained one of the world's poorest nations, a reality that stood in stark contrast to the riches buried beneath its soil. If this colonial-era gold could be reclaimed, it would represent more than just financial redemption. It would be a form of historical justice, a righting of a foundational wrong. The city of Geneva greeted them with its characteristic efficiency and discretion. A modest diplomatic reception at the airport, arranged to maintain their cover story, was followed by a secure convoy to a boutique hotel nestled in the city center. There was no time to rest. Within an hour of arriving, Traoré, accompanied only by security chief Ouedraogo and a single, plain-clothed bodyguard, set out on foot for the coordinates indicated in the mysterious message. The location proved to be an unassuming building in the heart of Geneva's financial district. Its elegant marble facade gave no indication of its purpose, with only a small, polished brass plaque near the entrance reading, "Sécuritas discrète ça." Inside, the atmosphere was one of hushed, sterile professionalism. A receptionist greeted them with a neutral politeness that betrayed no curiosity. "We believe a safety deposit box has been reserved for our access," Traoré explained, his voice steady as he presented the alphanumeric code from the note. The receptionist examined the code, her expression unchanging, then made a discreet phone call, her words murmured in quiet French. Moments later, an elderly man in an impeccable, dark suit emerged from an interior office. He was tall and thin, with an air of quiet authority. "President Traoré," he said, surprising them with his immediate recognition and a slight, formal bow. "I am Monsieur Blanc, the facility director. This is most unusual. We typically require advanced notice for diplomatic visits." "I understand," Traoré replied, matching the director's calm demeanor. "However, the matter is both urgent and highly confidential." Blanc studied him for a long moment, his intelligent eyes seeming to weigh the man before him. Then, he gave a slow nod. "The box you seek was indeed established with unusual provisions. It can only be accessed by the sitting president of Burkina Faso upon presentation of this specific code. And," he added, a hint of intrigue in his voice, "only during the period specified in the original agreement." "Which is?" Traoré asked, his heart pounding. "The box becomes permanently sealed after exactly 72 hours from the moment the notification was delivered to you," Blanc stated. He consulted a sleek tablet on his desk. "According to our records, that gives you approximately 58 hours remaining." Blanc personally led them through a labyrinth of security checkpoints, each more sophisticated than the last, biometric scanners, pressure-sensitive floors, sound-dampening walls. Finally, they entered a vast, climate-controlled vault room. The air was cold and still. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with stainless steel safety deposit boxes of varying sizes, each bearing only an engraved number. Box 1960081, Blanc announced, stopping before a medium-sized drawer at eye level. If you would provide the access code once more. Traoré stepped forward and entered the code from the message into a digital keypad. For a tense moment, there was only silence. Then, a soft, satisfying click echoed in the vault, and the drawer slid open by a few centimeters. "I will leave you in privacy," Blanc said, stepping back with practiced discretion. "Please use the consultation room through that door when you are ready to examine the contents." Once they were alone, Traoré exchanged a look with Ouedraogo. The silence in the vault was immense. Whatever lay inside this box could vindicate his reckless journey or condemn it as a fool's errand. With steady hands, he pulled the drawer open fully. There was no glittering gold. Instead, the box contained a single, sealed metal container, surprisingly heavy for its size. He lifted it out and carried it to the adjacent private consultation room. Inside the sealed container were 3 items. A small, modern USB drive. A heavy, leather-bound journal with yellowed pages, its cover embossed with the faded insignia of the French colonial administration of Upper Volta. And finally, a small, ornate golden key, its design unlike anything modern. The evidence was a bombshell, but it only deepened the mystery. The documents on the USB drive, once connected to their secure laptop, proved the theft beyond any doubt, with scanned colonial records and orders for the strategic relocation of precious metals. But the journal held the true narrative, and the key held the future. The gold was not here. The hunt had just begun. In the sterile silence of the Swiss vault's consultation room, the outside world ceased to exist. Time itself seemed to have compressed, focused on the 3 objects lying on the polished mahogany table. Ouedraogo, the security chief, carefully connected the USB drive to a secure laptop they had brought. The screen came alive, revealing hundreds of scanned documents, official colonial records, bureaucratic correspondence between Paris and the administrators in Ouagadougou, and detailed inventories of gold reserves accumulated between 1945 and 1960. Most crucially, it contained the direct orders for the strategic relocation of precious metal assets in anticipation of territorial transition. It was the bureaucratic language that masked a full-scale, ruthlessly efficient theft. But it was the journal that proved even more revealing. It was the personal diary of Jean-Baptiste Mercier, a mid-level French colonial administrator who, tormented by guilt, had documented the gold transfer operation in meticulous detail and with a growing sense of dread. His entries described his mounting discomfort with the mission. April 12, 1960, one entry read, "The scale of the operation becomes clearer daily. 40 tons of gold, accumulated from Upper Volta's mines over decades, to be removed without the knowledge of the incoming African government. I expressed concerns about the legality to Commissioner Dubois, who reminded me that, technically, all assets remain French property until the official independence date. A legalistic view that ignores moral reality." Later entries detailed the complex logistics of moving such quantities of gold secretly, including the creation of false documentation claiming much lower historical gold production for the region. The final entry, dated August 3, 1960, 2 days before Upper Volta's independence, was the most damning. "The last aircraft departed today. The vaults are empty. Paris has its gold and Upper Volta will begin its nationhood with empty coffers. Commissioner Dubois toasted our successful asset protection. I find I cannot share his satisfaction. History may call this prudent colonial administration. Truth would call it theft. This evidence is extraordinary," Ouedraogo whispered, after they had reviewed the documents. "But evidence alone doesn't recover gold. Where are the 40 tons now?" Traoré was studying the golden key closely. The colonial administration would have transferred it to Paris, Ouedraogo concluded, thinking aloud. But they wouldn't have publicly recorded it as coming from Upper Volta. It would have been absorbed into French national reserves, making it nearly impossible to identify or reclaim. "Perhaps not," Traoré said thoughtfully, his fingers tracing the key's intricate design. Mercier clearly had regrets. He documented everything and arranged for this evidence to be preserved for 60 years. What if he did more than that? What if this key is not a memento, but a guide? As they carefully repacked the items, an encrypted text message arrived from Minister Ouedraogo in Ouagadougou. Colonial archives confirm unusual gap. French diplomatic reaction to our inquiries strangely defensive. You were right. Something significant happened before independence. Back at their hotel, Traoré convened a secure video conference with his team in Ouagadougou. He shared what they had found in Geneva, the evidence of systematic theft and the mysterious key. The documents confirm the gold was taken to France, he explained. But recovering it will be extraordinarily difficult. We would need to prove specific gold in today's French reserves came from our territory 6 decades ago. Unless, Minister Ouedraogo suggested from the screen, Mercier left more than just documentation. That key must serve some purpose. Security Chief Ouedraogo, who had been quietly analyzing high-resolution photographs of the key, spoke up. It's an old-style safety deposit box key, but not Swiss design. It's French manufacturing, mid-20th century. So, we need to find a French bank with a 6-decade-old safety deposit box, Traoré concluded. But which one? There must be something in these materials that tells us. They spent hours analyzing the documents again, searching for any clue, any hidden reference, about the key's purpose. Finally, it was Professor Kabore, the archives director, who noticed something in Mercier's journal. There were occasional references to ensuring partition and divided security. I think he's using coded language, Kabore explained. He didn't trust his fellow administrators. What if he divided the evidence? The documentation in Switzerland, but something else in France? Traoré studied the journal entries again and noticed a pattern. Whenever Mercier mentioned partition or division, he also referenced personal visits to Paris, specifically to the Quartier Latin, or where the scholars gather. The Latin Quarter, Traoré realized, the intellectual heart of Paris. A search through historical records of banks and secure storage facilities in Paris's Latin Quarter from the 1960s yielded a promising lead. A small, private bank that had primarily served academics and publishing houses, known for its discretion and its century-old vault system. Though the bank had been absorbed by a larger financial institution in the 1980s, its original vault was reportedly still operational. The thread of hope had just become a clear path. A path that led directly into the heart of the nation that had betrayed them. I need to go to Paris, Traoré decided, the resolution in his voice filling the hotel room. The decision was met with immediate, strenuous opposition. Mr. President, entering France with this knowledge creates significant risk. Minister Ouedraogo objected strongly through the encrypted screen. French intelligence will certainly be monitoring your movements by now. It's a trap, which is why we need a diversion, Traoré replied. Announce publicly that I'll be attending an economic forum in Brussels tomorrow. The diplomatic channels are likely compromised, so they'll expect this to be true. Within hours, a carefully orchestrated plan was in motion. While official announcements indicated President Traoré would be traveling to Brussels, his actual aircraft filed a flight plan for Luxembourg. From there, he would travel by secure ground transportation to Paris, maintaining a communications blackout except through encrypted channels. It was an audacious gamble, isolating him from his government and plunging him deep into hostile territory. Before departing Geneva, Traoré had one final task. He returned to Sécurité's discrète SA and requested a meeting with Director Blanc. The materials we found were quite illuminating, Traoré told him. But I'm curious, who established this box and when? Blanc consulted his records. The box was established in 1965 by a French citizen, Jean-Baptiste Mercier, he confirmed. The unusual access provisions were set then, with automatic notifications to be triggered if the box wasn't accessed within 60 years of creation. So, I'm the first to access it, Traoré said. Yes, Mr. President. The notification was programmed to be sent to whoever held your office in 2025. This revelation added another layer to the mystery. Someone had deliberately expedited Mercier's plan, sending the notification years before it was programmed to activate. But who, and why now? There was no time to dwell on it. The mission in Paris came first. The journey to Paris was tense but uneventful. Using diplomatic resources from a friendly European nation, Traoré and a minimal security detail entered France without detection. By midnight, they had reached the Latin Quarter, its narrow streets nearly empty at this hour. The former private bank was now a branch of Crédit National, its historic facade preserved, but its interior modernized. A pre-arranged meeting with the night manager, arranged through discreet financial channels with no mention of Traoré's identity, gave them access to the original vault area. "These old boxes haven't been accessed in years," the manager explained, leading them down to a subterranean level. "We maintain them for historical value and for the few legacy clients who insist on using them." The vault design was distinctly different from the Swiss facility, less technological, more mechanical, with brass fixtures and ornate metalwork reflecting its 19th-century origins. Traoré provided the number engraved on the golden key, and they were led to a corresponding box. When the key turned in the lock, the heavy drawer slid open smoothly, revealing a sealed metal tube approximately a meter long. The manager excused himself, leaving Traoré and Ouedraogo alone with the mysterious container. Inside the tube was a rolled document, protected by a waterproof coating. As they carefully unrolled it on the examination table, they found themselves looking at something extraordinary. It was a detailed map of a facility in rural France, with handwritten annotations in Mercier's now familiar script. The heading identified it as the Réserve d'Or National Site C, one of France's gold storage facilities. Most critically, the map highlighted a specific section labeled Acquisitions Coloniales 1945–1960, with detailed vault numbers, security protocols, and an administrator's access code handwritten in the margin. Mercier hadn't just told them about the theft, he had provided them with a literal map to the stolen gold. But there was more. Attached to the map was a typed letter addressed to the future leader of Upper Volta, Burkina Faso. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "60 years have passed since I participated in an act one came to recognize as criminal. The removal of your nation's gold reserves was presented to us as financial prudence, but was in truth nothing less than theft from a newborn nation. The enclosed documents provide the evidence and the location. The gold taken from your country was kept segregated within French reserves, partially from administrative routine, but also, I believe, from unspoken acknowledgement of its questionable status." The letter continued, "I have spent decades in quiet service to your country, establishing educational projects and healthcare initiatives in rural regions, attempting to repay a debt that was never mine alone to bear. This final act of disclosure is not enough for absolution, but perhaps it allows for justice. The evidence I've preserved will withstand scrutiny in international courts should that path be necessary. France has changed since 1960, as has the world. It is my hope that recognition and restitution can be achieved without conflict. With profound regret and hope for reconciliation, Jean-Baptiste Mercier." The letter was dated January 1965. "He spent the rest of his life trying to make amends," Ouedraogo said quietly. Traoré carefully reread the letter. "And he's given us the means to reclaim what was taken. But the most immediate question remained: how to use this information?" The map identified a high-security French government facility. They couldn't simply walk in and demand access, even with evidence of historical theft. They needed leverage. And for that, they needed this evidence to be secure and authenticated before France knew they had it. As dawn was about to break over Paris, Traoré prepared to make the boldest move of his life. As dawn broke over Paris, Traoré's mission entered its final, most perilous phase. Holed up in their secure safe house, he and his team worked with a feverish urgency. Digital copies of all materials, from both the Swiss and French vaults, were transmitted through secure channels to trusted legal advisors in multiple countries. The original physical documents were entrusted to diplomatic pouches bound for Ouagadougou via secure routes. The evidence was now decentralized and protected. With this safety net in place, Traoré made his move. He contacted the office of the French president directly, requesting an urgent, private meeting regarding a historical matter affecting both our nations. The unusual request, coming from an African leader who was not officially in France, created exactly the diplomatic confusion Traoré had anticipated. By mid-morning, French intelligence had confirmed Traoré's presence in Paris, creating a delicate situation. Publicly acknowledging his unofficial visit would raise questions. Ignoring the request from a head of state would be diplomatically problematic. After hours of behind-the-scenes consultation, a response came. The French president, Marcel Fournier, would meet Traoré privately at the Elysée Palace that evening. "They're scrambling to understand why I'm here and what I know," Traoré told Ouedraogo as they prepared for the meeting. "That uncertainty gives us an advantage." The presidential palace was a stark reminder of France's imperial history, its grandeur built in part through colonial exploitation. As Traoré was escorted through ornate hallways to a private meeting room, he carried with him not just Mercier's evidence, but the weight of a historical injustice that had shaped his nation's trajectory. French President Marcel Fournier greeted him with a diplomatic cordiality that couldn't quite mask his confusion and concern. "President Traoré, this is certainly an unexpected pleasure. Your presence in Paris without official notification is unusual. Some matters require discretion before they can become official," Traoré replied, taking the offered seat at a small conference table. "And what matter brings you to Paris so urgently?" Fournier asked. Traoré placed a folder on the table. 40 tons of gold, President Fournier. Removed from my country days before independence in 1960. Fournier's expression remained neutral, but a slight tension in his posture revealed the impact of Traoré's words. "That's a significant claim about events more than 6 decades in the past." "Not a claim, a documented fact," Traoré said, opening the folder, revealing copies of the colonial records, Mercier's journal entries, and photographs of the gold removal. "Your predecessor's administration systematically emptied our national reserves before granting independence, ensuring Burkina Faso would begin its nationhood in poverty despite decades of gold production." Fournier examined the documents with the careful neutrality of an experienced politician. "These appear to be colonial administrative records, President Traoré. Historical documents can provide important insights, but drawing modern conclusions requires careful context." "The context is clear," Traoré replied calmly. "Gold that rightfully belonged to the people of Burkina Faso was taken without consent or compensation. That gold, valued at approximately €2.3 billion at current prices, has been held in French reserves for over 60 years. Even if these events occurred as you described," Fournier said carefully, "there are complex questions of historical jurisdiction, colonial-era legal frameworks, and statutes of limitation." "I anticipated that response," Traoré said, revealing the final document, the map of the French gold repository with its detailed annotations. "Which is why I also have this." Fournier's composure faltered visibly as he recognized the classified floor plan of a current national security facility. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his tone losing its diplomatic veneer. "From the same French official who documented the gold removal and spent the rest of his life regretting his role in it." Jean-Baptiste Mercier was thorough in preserving evidence, including the specific location where colonial gold was stored separately from other reserves. The room fell silent as the full implications settled between them. Not only did Traoré have historical evidence of the gold removal, but he had current classified information about one of France's most secure facilities. It was checkmate. "What exactly are you proposing, President Traoré?" Fournier finally asked. "Justice, not confrontation," Traoré replied. "The return of what was taken, through a process that allows both our nations to move forward with dignity. This evidence could be presented to international courts or released publicly, creating a diplomatic crisis neither of us wants. Or we can address this historical wrong directly between us." What followed was 5 hours of intense negotiation. By the end of the night, an agreement had been outlined. France would not directly acknowledge theft, but would establish a historical reconciliation and development fund, specifically for Burkina Faso, capitalized with gold transfers equivalent to the amount documented by Mercier. In exchange, all evidence would remain confidential. As the meeting concluded, Fournier asked the question that had likely been on his mind throughout. "How did you discover this after so many decades?" Mercier's evidence was meant to remain sealed until 2025. "That remains a mystery," Traoré admitted. "Someone sent me the notification early. I still don't know who or why now." As he left the Elysée Palace, the first light of dawn was breaking over Paris. Traoré was returning to Burkina Faso, carrying with him not gold, not yet, but something perhaps more valuable: the promise of historical justice and the resources to transform his nation's future. The journey back to Ouagadougou was marked by a careful silence. No announcements were made, No hints given about the momentous agreement taking shape. Upon his return, Traoré gathered his closest advisors to explain what had transpired and the complex work that lay ahead. "We've achieved something unprecedented," he told them. "Not just the recovery of stolen resources, but acknowledgement, however carefully phrased, of the historical wrongs that have shaped our nation's trajectory." The next 3 months were devoted to careful negotiation of the final agreement. International legal experts, financial advisors, and diplomatic strategists worked to create a framework that would satisfy both nations' requirements while ensuring the gold would genuinely benefit Burkina Faso's development. During this period, the mystery of the early notification lingered. A discreet investigation led by Security Chief Ouedraogo eventually provided an answer. Jean-Baptiste Mercier had died in 1998, after decades of quiet philanthropic work in rural Burkina Faso. His only child, Marie Mercier, had continued his educational initiatives through a small foundation. When diagnosed with a terminal illness in early 2025, she had made the decision to activate her father's contingency plan early, ensuring she would live to see the resolution he had worked toward. Marie Mercier had died 2 weeks after sending the notification to Traoré, never knowing if her father's 60-year quest for redemption would succeed. 6 months after Traoré's clandestine visit to Paris, a formal ceremony was held in Ouagadougou to announce the establishment of the Franco-Burkinabe Historical Reconciliation and Development Fund. The carefully worded joint statement spoke of addressing historical imbalances and recognizing the complex legacy of the colonial era, without explicitly acknowledging theft. But the substance of the agreement was clear. Gold valued at €2.3 billion would be transferred to Burkina Faso over 3 years, with the first shipment of 10 tons arriving the day of the announcement. The day of the ceremony was one of restrained national celebration. To the world, it was a landmark diplomatic accord. To the people of Burkina Faso, it was the recovery of a piece of their soul, an acknowledgement that their poverty was not a destiny, but the result of an injustice. The story seemed to have reached its triumphant conclusion. The gold was coming home. The historical wrong was being righted. Traoré's mission had succeeded beyond all expectation. But then, as the country celebrated, another unmarked package arrived at the presidential office. The package was handled with extreme caution, screened for hazards before being brought to Traoré's secure conference room. Inside was a flash drive and a handwritten note, in the same distinctive script as the message that had started their journey. The note was brief and chilling. "The gold was only the beginning. Marie entrusted me with one final task before her death. The evidence on this drive reveals Operation Crocodile, the systematic misdirection of resource surveys across Francophone Africa from 1960 to 1985. What they found and what they reported were deliberately different. Coordinates enclosed. 48 hours before others receive the same information. An old debt continues to unravel." Security Chief Ouedraogo had already verified the flash drive's contents. It contained hundreds of classified documents from the French geological survey missions conducted across former colonies after independence. Most significantly, it revealed a coordinated program to provide newly independent African nations with incomplete or deliberately misleading geological data, while maintaining accurate surveys for French corporate and governmental use. If this was authentic, it meant every resource survey conducted in Francophone Africa during this period potentially understated or completely omitted critical mineral deposits, particularly resources that weren't commercially valuable then but became crucial later, like rare earth elements. The coordinates included in the message pointed to locations across 5 West African nations, all former French colonies, which corresponded to resource deposits identified but deliberately omitted from official reports. The implications were staggering. The theft hadn't ended in 1960 with the gold. It had continued for decades, in a more subtle but perhaps more damaging form. A generation of African nations had been denied the knowledge of their own wealth, leaving them in a position of negotiating weakness with international corporations and former colonial powers. Traoré glanced at the clock. He had a 48-hour head start before this information leaked and a corporate feeding frenzy engulfed the region. The gold was not the end of the story. It was the prologue to a much deeper revelation, one that had the power to redefine the future not just of Burkina Faso, but of an entire continent. The stakes had just been raised exponentially. In the secure conference room, the jubilation over the recovered gold had evaporated, replaced by a tense, almost disbelieving silence. The weight of the new revelation was far heavier than 40 tons of gold. The gold represented a single crime, an act of pillage at a nation's birth. Operation Crocodile was something far more sinister. A decades-long conspiracy to keep a continent in the dark, a theft not of tangible wealth, but of knowledge and potential. This explains everything, Professor Kabore, the historian, finally said, his voice barely a whisper. Decades of baffling economic studies. Nations blessed with rich geology yet languishing in poverty. We always assumed it was mismanagement or a lack of technology. But it was a deception. A strategic deception. Finance Minister Ouedraogo stared at the screen where the classified documents scrolled by. They forced us to negotiate blind, she said, a cold, controlled anger in her voice. For 60 years, international corporations have come to us with their own surveys, telling us what we had and what it was worth. And we believed them. We bargained away the rights to our resources based on information we now know was a deliberate lie. She paused, taking in the enormity of it. The rare earth element deposits are new surveys just discovered in the eastern provinces, they aren't new. They were on these French maps from 1972. The implications were staggering. Not just Burkina Faso, but Niger, Mali, Senegal, and Côte d'Ivoire might all be sitting on undocumented mineral wealth. Resources that could transform their development trajectories just as the returned gold was transforming Burkina Faso's. We need to verify this information immediately, Traoré said, his mind already working on the strategic angles. And we need to understand why we've been given 48 hours before others receive it. The answer to the second question came later that evening. Intelligence sources reported unusual activity at several major mining corporations with interests in West Africa. Executives were being recalled from vacations, technical teams mobilized, and legal departments working overtime. Someone has leaked hints about massive rare earth deposits in the region, Security Chief Ouedraogo reported. Not the specific coordinates, but enough to trigger a corporate gold rush. Whoever sent us this has also lit the fuse on the other side. Traoré understood the strategy instantly. In a matter of days, these companies will be approaching all the governments in the region with proposals, offers, and pressure, he concluded. They will create a competitive environment where nations might make hasty decisions without full information. They'll play one against the other, just as they always have. Unless, Minister Ouedraogo added, they already know what they truly have. The decision was made quickly. The time for deliberation was over. It was time for action. Traoré saw the geopolitical chessboard with stark clarity. He could use this information to secure Burkina Faso's resources and negotiate an unprecedented deal for his own nation. But the anonymous sender hadn't just given him Burkina Faso's coordinates, they had given him 5 nations' worth. The goal wasn't to enrich one country, it was to dismantle a system. They expect us to fight each other for the scraps from the master's table, Traoré told his team, his voice ringing with a new authority. They expect Niger to try and outbid Mali, for Senegal to try and undercut Côte d'Ivoire. That is the old story. But what if we refuse to play their game? What if, for once, history does not repeat itself? He made a decision that would redefine his presidency and, potentially, the future of the region. He would not act alone. He would personally contact the presidents of the 4 other nations identified in the documents. He would share everything, the complete evidence of Operation Crocodile. It was an enormous risk. He would be sharing the most valuable intelligence his nation possessed with neighbors who were often competitors. But it was the only move that mattered. That night, emergency, secure communications were initiated. One by one, Traoré spoke to his counterparts, explaining the source and significance of the evidence. We have 48 hours before mining corporations begin approaching each of us with proposals based on information they've had for decades while we remained in the dark, he told them. I suggest we use this time not to compete, but to coordinate our response. I propose an emergency summit, here in Ouagadougou, within the next 24 hours. Come and see the evidence for yourselves. He hung up the final call and a heavy silence filled the room. He had laid all the cards on the table. The fate of an entire region now rested on how 4 leaders would respond to his call, on whether they would choose the distrust of the past, or the possibility of a unified future. The response was cautious but swift. Decades of regional competition and varying political alignments had created deep-seated barriers to cooperation, but the evidence Traoré presented was too compelling, the threat too immediate, to ignore. Within 24 hours, the leaders of Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Côte d'Ivoire, along with their top technical and ministerial representatives, had arrived in Ouagadougou. The emergency summit was held not in a grand hall, but in the same secure conference room where Traoré had first learned of Operation Crocodile. The atmosphere was electric with a mixture of anger, shock, and a dawning sense of historic opportunity. Technical teams worked through the night, comparing the newly revealed historical surveys with their own recent assessments. The pattern was undeniable and consistent across all 5 countries. Critical strategic minerals, particularly rare earth elements, uranium, and certain high-grade precious metals, had been systematically omitted from the official reports provided to their governments after independence. This wasn't just information asymmetry, declared Niger's mining minister, his voice trembling with fury. This was strategic resource control. By evening, in the face of this shared betrayal, the old rivalries began to dissolve. The outline of an unprecedented agreement emerged: the West African Resource Sovereignty Alliance. Its founding principles were revolutionary: shared technical assessment of all newly identified resource deposits, coordinated negotiations with international mining interests, a commitment to regional development of processing capacity to ensure value addition remained in Africa, and a unified approach to addressing historical resource misdirection with former colonial powers. Most significantly, the alliance established minimum standards for any resource development agreements, including majority local ownership and mandatory technology transfer. As the summit concluded, Traoré addressed his fellow leaders. What began with Burkina Faso's gold has revealed a broader pattern affecting all our nations. But the response to that pattern is what truly matters. Together, we have the opportunity to transform how Africa's resources serve Africa's people. The impact was immediate. The following day, when international mining executives began arriving with their hastily prepared proposals, they found not individual nations eager for investment at any cost, but a coordinated alliance with full knowledge of what they possessed and unprecedented leverage. The familiar tactic of playing one nation against another was useless. For the first time, they were forced to negotiate on Africa's terms. In the years that followed, the alliance transformed the region. The new, equitable resource deals funded a wave of development: schools, hospitals, and research institutes. The story of the gold and Operation Crocodile became a modern legend, a case study taught across the continent. Inspired by the model, other African nations began establishing similar regional cooperation frameworks. The narrative around African resources was changing, from extractives to be exploited to strategic assets to be governed for long-term national benefit. 5 years after the formation of the alliance, Ibrahim Traoré stood on the stage of the newly completed African Resources Governance Institute in Ouagadougou, built with proceeds from Burkina Faso's repatriated gold. Before him sat delegates from across the continent. He acknowledged the source of the transformation: the courage of Jean-Baptiste Mercier, who documented the crimes, and his daughter, Marie, who ensured the truth would not remain buried. Their actions, he said, reminded them all that historical justice often depends on individual conscience transcending institutional loyalty. What had begun with a cryptic message about 40 tons of gold had catalyzed a continent-wide reassessment of resource sovereignty. The transformation that started with a single act of conscience, preserved and amplified by a daughter's determination, had reshaped not just Burkina Faso, but the entire paradigm of resource governance. The golden legacy was not the recovered wealth from the past, but a future being built on foundations of transparency, sovereignty, and regional cooperation. What had begun as a quest to recover stolen treasure had become something far more valuable: a template for transforming historical injustice into future possibility. 5 years after the formation of the West African Resource Sovereignty Alliance, Ibrahim Traoré stood on the stage of the newly completed African Resources Governance Institute in Ouagadougou. The building itself was a testament to how far they had come: a world-class research and educational facility, built with proceeds from Burkina Faso's repatriated gold and staffed by African scientists, economists, and policy experts who had once worked for international mining corporations but had returned to contribute to the continent's transformation. Before him sat delegates from 37 African nations, gathered for the first Pan-African Resource Sovereignty Summit. 5 years ago, Traoré began, his voice echoing through the Grand Hall. We stood at a crossroads. 5 nations with newly discovered knowledge about our own resources, facing the same patterns of extraction that had shaped our post-colonial experience for decades. He gestured to the 4 other founding members of the alliance seated in the front row. What began as a response to historical injustice has evolved into something much more significant: a new model for how Africa's resources can serve Africa's development on Africa's terms. The evidence was visible not just in Burkina Faso, but across the alliance nations. New processing facilities ensured raw materials were no longer simply exported. Educational systems were revitalized, and healthcare infrastructure had expanded dramatically. But before turning to the summit's ambitious policy discussions, Traoré addressed the human story that had made it all possible. None of this would have been possible without 2 individuals who chose conscience over complicity, he said, directing attention to a portrait of Jean-Baptiste and Marie Mercier that hung in the Institute's main hall. A father and daughter who devoted their lives to revealing truths that powerful interests had buried. As the summit proceedings began, Traoré took a moment to meet privately with a special guest, Pierre Mercier, the grandson of Jean-Baptiste and nephew of Marie, who had been located in Canada, where he worked as an environmental engineer. Your family's legacy has transformed not just Burkina Faso, but increasingly the entire continent, Traoré told him in a quiet meeting room. Pierre, a thoughtful man in his 40s who bore a striking resemblance to his grandfather, shook his head in quiet amazement. I knew my grandfather had worked in colonial administration and later became involved in educational projects in West Africa. But the full extent of his actions, this was all unknown to me until your government made contact. Your Aunt Marie never shared this with you? Traoré asked. We were not close, Pierre admitted. There was some family estrangement after my grandfather devoted so much of his life and resources to his work in Africa. My father, Marie's brother, didn't understand or approve of what he saw as an abandonment of family obligations for a foreign cause. Yet now you are here, Traoré observed. Pierre nodded, his gaze drifting to the window overlooking the Institute's courtyard, where delegates from across Africa were gathering. Once I understood what they had done, the moral stand they had taken, I couldn't stay away. I needed to see what had grown from their actions. Traoré led him to the window. What you see is just the beginning, he said. The physical infrastructure, the economic growth, these are important, but secondary. The primary transformation is in governance, in sovereignty, in our relationship to our own resources and to the world. He turned to face Pierre directly. Your grandfather and aunt understood something fundamental. That genuine independence requires not just political sovereignty, but resource sovereignty. They provided the evidence that allowed us to reclaim both. The personal atonement of one family had catalyzed the political and economic realignment of a continent, a legacy far more profound and enduring than gold. The Pan-African Summit was a resounding success. On the final day, 32 of the 37 participating nations signed the Ouagadougou Declaration, establishing a continent-wide framework for resource governance, committing to harmonized transparency standards and mutual support in negotiations. The West African Alliance had become the blueprint for a new, Pan-African approach. As the delegates departed, Traoré received an update from Security Chief Ouedraogo that added yet another dimension to the unfolding story. Analysis of communication patterns surrounding the initial corporate rush, the one that had been triggered just before Traoré received the Operation Crocodile files, had revealed something unexpected. The source of the leak wasn't Western mining interests. It was a Chinese state-affiliated geological research institute. It appears someone wanted to trigger a Western corporate scramble into the region, Ouedraogo explained quietly. Perhaps hoping our governments would quickly align with familiar Western corporations before Chinese interests could establish a strong position. Making our alliance even more significant, Traoré observed. We are not just addressing historical exploitation from one corner, but positioning ourselves independently in a modern geopolitical resource competition. This revelation confirmed what Traoré had suspected. The timing of Marie Mercier's information being released was connected to contemporary geopolitical maneuvering. The competition between global powers for resource access was creating both risks and opportunities. The anonymous historian who had held Marie's final package had released it at precisely the moment it would have the most impact, forcing the West African nations to unite just as they were about to be pulled apart by competing global interests. The following day, Traoré traveled to the rural region where the Mercier Foundation School and Clinic had grown into a thriving community development center. Pierre Mercier, having decided to stay in Burkina Faso to learn more about his family's legacy, asked to accompany him. As they toured the facilities, now expanded with resources from the repatriated gold, Pierre was visibly moved. "My grandfather never spoke about his work in colonial administration," he said as they walked through gardens planted by local schoolchildren. "Now I understand why. The weight of what he had witnessed, what he had been a part of. Yet he chose a different path," Traoré observed. "Not just regret, but active restitution." They stopped at a simple memorial at the center of the complex. It was a replica of the original school Jean-Baptiste Mercier had funded in the 1970s. A plaque bore his original words, "In service of a debt that cannot be fully repaid." Pierre touched the plaque gently. "I always wondered why he spent so much time and so much of our family's resources here. Now I understand. He was attempting to balance scales that could never truly be balanced." But the attempt itself, Traoré agreed, mattered more than he could have imagined. That evening, returning to Ouagadougou, Traoré received news that promised to expand the circle of revelation even further. Researchers at the New Governance Institute, analyzing the documents from Operation Crocodile, had discovered references to similar geological survey manipulations in former British, Belgian, and Portuguese colonies. The pattern wasn't unique to Francophone Africa, the research director explained in her report. It appears to have been standard practice across all colonial powers, providing newly independent nations with incomplete or misleading information about their own resource wealth. This discovery suggested that the resource sovereignty movement, born from a single clue about French theft, had the potential to extend far beyond the initial alliance, potentially encompassing the entire continent. Nations that had long operated with incomplete knowledge of their own mineral wealth might now have the opportunity to reassess their governance based on accurate information. The echoes of Jean-Baptiste Mercier's quiet confession were growing louder, promising to shake the foundations of post-colonial economic relationships across all of Africa. The journey that began with a single envelope was far from over, it was becoming a continental awakening. 10 years after receiving the mysterious envelope that had started his journey, Ibrahim Traoré stood at the graduation ceremony for the first class of Mercier scholars. 50 young men and women from 23 African nations had completed advanced training in resource governance, geological assessment, and sustainable development at the institute in Ouagadougou. The hall was filled with an energy that was palpable, a mixture of intellectual rigor and profound hope. As he addressed these graduates, Traoré reflected on how a single act of conscience had set in motion events that were fundamentally reshaping Africa's relationship with its natural wealth. The Pan-African Resource Governance Framework had expanded to include 43 nations. Processing facilities ensured that raw materials were increasingly transformed into higher-value products within African borders, breaking the centuries-old pattern of extraction. The continent's strategic minerals reserve had become a significant force in global markets, giving African nations unprecedented leverage. After the ceremony, Traoré took a moment to visit the institute's memorial hall. At its center stood a simple, elegant display: the original safety deposit box from Geneva, the golden key from Paris, and a single, polished gold bar from the first repatriated shipment. Alongside these artifacts were portraits of Jean-Baptiste and Marie Mercier. Beneath their images was an inscription in multiple languages: "Truth revealed, justice pursued, legacy transformed." He was joined by Pierre Mercier, who had remained in Burkina Faso, eventually accepting a position as an environmental advisor to the Governance Institute. "My grandfather could never have imagined this," Pierre said, his voice filled with awe as he gestured to the hall filled with graduates and dignitaries from across the continent. From his small act of documentation to continental transformation. Perhaps not the specific form, Traoré agreed. But I believe he understood the power of truth revealed at the right moment. That is why he preserved the evidence so carefully, ensuring it would eventually come to light. Together they watched as the new graduates, the future leaders of Africa's resource governance, gathered around the exhibits, absorbing the history that had created their opportunity. The most valuable resource was never the gold itself, Traoré observed. It was the truth about the gold, about how it was taken, and what it represented. That truth created the possibility for genuine sovereignty, not just political but economic and developmental. That night, in his office, Traoré penned a letter to be placed in the Institute's time capsule, scheduled to be opened 50 years in the future. To those who read these words in the years to come, he wrote, "The transformation you inherit began with a single act of conscience. From that seed grew first the recovery of stolen wealth, then the revelation of hidden knowledge, then a new model of resource governance that transformed not just a nation, but a continent. It taught us that genuine independence requires not just political sovereignty, but resource sovereignty. It taught us that historical injustice, while it cannot be undone, can become the catalyst for creating more just systems for future generations. What was taken from us, gold, knowledge, opportunity, has been reclaimed, not merely as compensation for past wrongs, but as the foundation for future possibilities. May you who read these words have built wisely upon this foundation." As Traoré sealed the letter, he reflected on the unlikely chain of events. A colonial official's crisis of conscience, a daughter's determination to fulfill her father's mission, and a mysterious message that had arrived at precisely the right moment. What had begun as a quest to recover 40 tons of gold had evolved into a comprehensive reimagining of Africa's future. Outside his window, the lights of Ouagadougou shimmered in the African night, brighter, more widespread, and more evenly distributed than they had been a decade earlier. Similar transformation was spreading across the continent, as nations reclaimed not just their resources, but their destinies. The debt that Jean-Baptiste Mercier had sought to repay could never be fully balanced. But his act of conscience, preserved and amplified by his daughter's determination and realized through Traoré's leadership, had created something more valuable than repayment, a new beginning. The golden legacy was complete, not in the sense of ending, but in the sense of fullness. A circle of transformation that had begun with stolen wealth and culminated in sovereign development. What had been taken in darkness had returned in light, illuminating not just Burkina Faso's past, but Africa's future.